And let me just underscore to you, because of what Tony Tyler and we got into talking about with air traffic management, there is going to be a session at 3:15 building on some of the issues which Tony mentioned, and also Randy from Boeing, this issue of air traffic management, which is so critical, not least with the costs under pressure with the new business models, even though revenues seem to be pretty buoyant at the moment, judging by the kind of data we've had from IATA even in the last few hours. Let me now hand over to Peter Bunce, who's President and Chief Executive of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, who's going to moderate Making Aviation Growth Sustainable. Can the industry collectively adapt to overcome the barriers to growth? Peter, I'd suggest the emphasis is on collectively and adapt. Two critical words there. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Nick. And if I could ask my panelists come on up and take seats while I talk a little bit about this very distinguished group of aviation professionals that we have here today. The topic is sustainability, and when you first use that term, a lot of people immediately think about emissions and environment, but today we're going to broaden that a little bit, not only to talk about our environmental contributions and what we're doing to be able to reduce our emissions, but also to be able to discuss what we've got to do as an industry to be able to keep us going forward when we look at the projections for employments now and in the future, but also how we're going to keep this global industry growing from a manufacturer base and also with our workforce. So as we look at the panelists here today, we cover a broad brush. We're looking at airports, we're looking at industry trade associations, manufacturers, and government regulators, because obviously it's that work with the regulators, with industry, that allow us to move forward and be able to overcome some of the regulatory barriers and the institutional barriers that keep us from growing the way we would like to grow. I'll start on my far left with Hussein Dabbas. He's the Regional Vice President for the International Air Transport Association. And obviously we heard from Tony this morning about some of the challenges that we have, particularly with ATM, which ties very closely in to our environmental improvements. So I know that Hussein will have some good inputs for us. Next to him, we have Mohammed Abubaker Farea. And Mohammed is the Director of Aviation Development and Planning for the Department of Transportation of Abu Dhabi, and as such, we know that his insights and perspectives as a government regulator and a government agency, being able to work with his colleagues in other areas of the government, both on the civil side and the military side, will provide us some insights into how we can keep this growth sustainable. Next to Mohammed is Paul Stein, who is the Chief Scientific Officer for Rolls-Royce. And the role of technology and what we're able to do to be able to make our aircraft and also our system within our industry become more efficient is something that Paul will be able to give us his insights over. Next to Paul, Captain Aysha Al-Hamili, and Captain Hamili is the United Arab Emirates permanent representative before the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, up in Montreal. She brings us a perspective from being up there for over 5 years of what's happening up in Montreal to be able to keep this industry growing. And I also want to mention that as a fellow aviator, it's neat that, to me, that Aysha happens to be the first woman to receive her commercial pilot's license here in the Emirates back in 1998. So she's been a pilot for quite a while. And finally, Jonas von Stekelenburg is the Managing Director of Schiphol Airport. I told Jonas earlier today that I fly through Schiphol all the time, and I appreciate all the great service that they provide us up there, but a lot of throughput through that airport, and providing that great perspective that we have from our airports is important in this discussion. So a few words just overall about manufacturers. And as we go forward, my organization is a global industry association of manufacturers and large MRO facilities that have to be able to deal with regulators across the planet. Now, we obviously know the states of design drove a lot of the train early on in the development of our industry, whether we're talking the United States or the different authorities that were in Europe from each individual country. But now we've had the growth of IATA and now obviously the growth of Eurocontrol, and now we're seeing the merging of that. But as other players became more prominent in the marketplace, whether you're talking Transport Canada, ANAC in Brazil, the CAC in China, the government to industry regulatory function becomes very critical. And what we're finding from a manufacturer standpoint is as we deal with more regulators out there and regulators become more active in the aviation airspace, there's a propensity to want to grow bureaucracies. And it's tough as you grow bureaucracies, you become more restrictive. And as you become more restrictive and having to have barriers for industry to get through them, what happens when all of a sudden there is not the money within the federal government system to be able to support that bureaucracy with enough regulators to be able to keep the industry growing? So that's a challenge for all of us, whether we're manufacturers or operators, that we'll touch on during our discussion today. A demand for efficiency is something that our customers expect. And efficiency, whether it's on the government side or efficiency from us as industry, is something important. That efficiency happens in the environment, but it also happens in just throughput to be able to get through the ATM system. So we'll touch on that today. And then finally, just looking at the structure and the commonality of regulations between nations. One of the impediments that our industry, that we've seen, and we heard that through our discussions this morning, is how do we use our international institutions, our regional organizations, and our individual work within our governments to be able to go and make sure that we have common systems on aircraft, common systems on the ground, and they all can communicate so that we can efficiently move aircraft through the system. So I think what I'd like to start with is start on that international level, and I'll ask Captain Hamili to start and really give us an overview, if you would, Aysha, on what is happening up at ICAO when you look at, particularly on the environmental standpoint. We know what happened in Europe last week with continuation basically of the current policy through 2016 to see if ICAO can come up with a global solution as we look toward the implementation of market-based measures later on. So can you kind of let us know overall what's happening in ICAO?
Thank you very much, Pete. First of all, Kyoto have entrusted ICAO to reduce and limit its emissions from the aviation. And since that time, ICAO have been very active in setting up operational measures, technological measures, and one of the baskets of measures is developing market-based measures, which you have just mentioned. We forget that ICAO is doing so much when it comes to operations. We forget that we have operational measures such as the continuous descent operations and the vertical minimas, and we forget the air traffic management in general. And we forget also that ICAO is in the forefront when it comes to the helping states in implementing these measures through the headquarters or through the regional offices around the globe. Also, what ICAO have been doing, and this happened in 2009 in Rio, we agreed that ICAO will be the platform to discuss and share information about biofuels and will help states in the area of research, development, and the deployment of biofuel. Market-based measures is one of those aspects to reduce operations or to reduce emissions. Emissions from aviation is only 2%. It's not a big number, but the problem is with the increase, which is 4 times, which is speculated to be 4 times each year. And that's why the media has so much attention on aviation. And the problem we are facing today within ICAO, the pressure to develop market-based measure, which is agreeable globally, before the other organization or non-government organization, including the UNFCCC, to come up with a measure just to have a way to revenue generate out of the sector. And this will have really a big impact on the reinvesting in the sector. Since I joined in 2009, we have been having high-level meetings, and all the focus is on developing one agreeable market-based measure. In 2010, right before the assembly, we had a high-level group, which is like an ad hoc group, which was set by the president, which I was chairing. And we had a company which came up with 6 options, and our task, as council members, to choose, to minimize it into 3 options. And the 3 options that were discussed over the past year were the mandatory offsetting, and the mandatory offsetting plus a revenue generating mechanism, and of course, an ETS, which is an emission trading scheme. In 2000, and now this year actually, in the Assembly last year, 2013, for the first time, the Assembly agrees to develop one global market-based measure. And this has been a very ahead step when it comes to ICAO, since we have now the battle between the developing and developed states when it comes to agreeing on market-based measure. The European dialogue have been happening. We started the European dialogue between, I'm talking ICAO and the Europeans, since 3 years now. And ICAO Council was not happy about the pressure that the Europeans are placing on ICAO to develop one scheme and to come up with one agreeable scheme globally within this council session, within this assembly. And we have been able, through ICAO Council, to pressure the Europeans to slow it down, because I don't know if everybody is aware of the trade war that would have been started if the European went ahead with their ETS scheme. So through ICAO, we've been talking to European Union, and as we heard actually recently, they are going to delay it or stop the clock until 2016. So the recent development within ICAO and within the ICAO Council, we just had formed a group, which is the advisory group to the Council, and their task will be to consolidate all the information that ICAO have been gathering and working on since Kyoto. And we have something called now a straw man, and it is not really a brainstorming, but the straw man is actually having hypothetical measures, and the idea is for everybody to see where are we and what can we pick and choose for the next assembly. So hopefully next assembly we will have one scheme that will be agreed on, but remember, this scheme will not be deployed until 2020, which is the deadline to start emission or any market-based measure.
Well, going on that theme of just looking at what ICAO is doing and taking it down a step further, both to the national level, to the regional level, Mohammed, when you look at the projections that they have out here, basically we're going to double traffic, about 3.1 to 3.3 million passengers per year, and going in 15 years and doubling that, and thinking about what kind of infrastructure, both in the air and on the ground, we'll need to be able to provide for that kind of throughput. What's your perspective from here in this region as to what needs to be done to be able to meet that demand?
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of making this truly global summit. It's been tremendous, and thank them for that. I think if I'm going to talk about UAE, first of all, UAE is being blessed by a great leadership that understand the importance of aviation. And in the second aspect of it, that our geographic location, where we sit in the middle of the globe, so that we sit in a perfect position to connect the world. So I'll take after that the challenges that we are facing to double this amount into 2030. There is various elements that could be challenged to the UAE. One group of these challenges, I will actually group them, which basically under control. We had listened today to James Hogan today, the president and CEO of Etihad. He gave already about the airline perspective, how the airline will look, buying a new aircraft, want to connect, and investing in human, and investing in developing the airline. So this is one aspect of sustainable growth. The other aspect as well, we listened today to Tony Douglas, the CEO of Abu Dhabi Airports, which he gave his perspective about the infrastructure in Abu Dhabi, what we are doing to develop that infrastructure as an airport, how it will be, and how will cater for the expected growth in Etihad Airways. The second element is the human resources that should be available to cater for that growth. Now, if you look into that, I mean, Etihad Airways have a really inspiring program for developing pilot mass production of professional people within that arena. We have listened as well today to the CEO of Tawazun, what Abu Dhabi is doing in mass production of professional people in the aviation. So these elements, I will call them, is under control, which is basically under the direct control of the nation or the stakeholders. But there is another dimension of this where basically there is challenges which is not in direct control of the nation. One of them is the expected growth in air navigation, air movement. I think this is one of the challenges that will face UAE in the next 10 to 15 years. We understand today there is various studies and various recommendations, which is positively is taken, and I'm sure in here the GCA and the regulator is taking all the positive matter to actually overcome this. But with the other hand, because we are not alone in the aerospace, we have neighboring countries. So the neighboring country will be able to sustain or to take the flow of movement that coming in and out of UAE. So this is I think, a subject that we need to look into it look at it more and trying to come up with the solution how we will actually cater for that growth.
Hussein, looking at it from a global perspective and taking it from our carriers that travel this globe and have to deal with these different countries out there, the different systems that we have in place, from the airline's perspective, is open skies the solution? Is that the ultimate holy grail, or is it a combination of multiple things? We heard this morning, talked a little bit about what new types of air traffic management can do, 10% to 15% increases in our environmental efficiencies within the system. But what would be the path if the airlines, global airlines, had their way? What would be the way that we would go forward with sustainability?
Well, I mean, first of all, open skies is not the open skies is not really the solution for any airline's problem or the country's problems. On the contrary, the aviation industry is really a value chain across the board. So you cannot have a successful airline if you don't have a successful airport or air traffic management or ease of entry and so on and so forth. So the airlines really need to look very carefully on their business plan, and the governments need to understand the value of aviation, as my colleague has just recently just mentioned. It is very important for all governments to appreciate the value of aviation. Across the world, the aviation industry generates around 3.5% of the total GDP of most countries. In this part of the world, it's between 12 to 15%. So we are seeing that the Gulf states, particularly the UAE, let's take for example, the government really understands the value of aviation and has really supported that by building proper infrastructure and trying to make the airline sustainable. But what was mentioned earlier today by Tony Tyler is that unfortunately we're seeing that the growth in the infrastructure and the improvement in the infrastructure on the ground is not being met up in the sky. And this is where we believe that unless urgent things are done, we will be facing a problem of congested skies, which we are already facing, but to a limited extent. But it will become a major problem and a hindrance for any growth that the airlines are thinking of. As we saw in the last air show in Dubai, the huge orders by the three major carriers here in the Gulf, and those airplanes, when they start coming in, they need to fly, and unless there are routes available for them to fly in, it's going to become a problem of sustaining that growth and that development.
Jonas, if we take it down to the local perspective, and you look at an airport that's been around for a long time in a major metropolitan area, and the challenges that you have with just the amount of concrete on the ground, and especially the weather that you're constantly battling with at Schiphol. What does sustainability mean to you, and what issues come and percolate to you at the local level that you're challenged with each day?
Yeah, Schiphol Airport is compared with the situation over here. We have over 50 million passengers, and same like over here we have a main carrier, Air France KLM, doing mostly transfer traffic. So the Netherlands itself is only 60 million people, but the amount of passengers going through that country and through Amsterdam Airport Schiphol is enormous. So for us, on your question, sustainability is very important. We are a business, but we are for the most part publicly owned. And so, like in the 70s and in the 80s with noise, now again with climate change and air quality, for us, sustainability is very much a talk with the public. So, and what I want to contribute to this summit is that I think we need to have a story of, because it's very nice, all the pies. I've also seen them with the 5.4% growth. And it's very nice, the market-based measures that we're taking with ATS and ICAO and IATA doing their thing. But for the public mind, it's not enough. You don't understand pies and growth and 99 billion people at the planet. How are they all going to fly and feed themselves? So we need to do more. At Schiphol we do a lot. So we've bought all the buses at the airport, like up to 40, will be electric. All the taxis this year at Schiphol Airport will be electric. But that's easy. That's easy sustainability. That's sustainability that you just asked the best bidder and he will do it. But like discussed this morning and like Tony Tyler said also, on the air traffic control part, that's difficult. On the biofuels, you criticized me a little bit. Yeah, biofuels in the air, that's not really sustainable. I don't know, but I know that we need a story in 20 years, in 30 years time. So I look with envy to the picture of this country with the 2030 economic goals that they have. I think we need to have like these goals, and we need to work together, like airports, all the regular authorities, all the governments, and all the airlines. And now the difficult sustainability starts, and that has to do with, well, the air traffic control is a labor union thing, in the European world. So we need to tackle these problems, and we need cooperation. You need to give each other some wins, and this is difficult. And I think we just started with that whole process.
Paul, if you look at the manufacturer's contribution and ability to keep making significant contributions on the sustainability front, and you isolate it to the power plant and to the airframe on the aircraft itself, whether you're talking large commercial aircraft, or I'll tell a quick story. 2 weeks ago, flying in the system in the U.S., heard some chatter between air traffic control and one of the airlines asking what that aircraft was up above 40,000 feet. And the air traffic controller says the Gulfstream 650, and they asked if they could talk to the pilot, and they asked the pilot what altitude he really was at, and he was at flight level 430, and they said what speed, and he said 0.93 Mach, and there was silence on the network, and then all of a sudden the airline guy comes back and says, you're making us look bad. So we have a capability to be able to propel aircraft farther and faster on less fuel. But each one of those, as we have gone through time, we've been able to squeeze out more and more efficiency. Airframe design, composites, nacelle design, and engines. Is there a limit to what we can do, and are there trade-offs? Jonas just talked about noise. Are there trade-offs between noise and NOx, noise, CO2? How does that all work?
Yeah, that's very much so, Peter, and thanks for the lead-in. I mean, the aviation industry, we must never sit on our hands and be complacent, but for about the last 15 years, on average, we've managed to achieve around about 2% CO2 improvement on engine plus airframe, roughly half from each. So the airframes have moved on to more and more aerodynamic designs and winglets and all the things that you can see in modern aircraft design, culminating in the all-composite designs of the A350 and the 787. And as engine manufacturers, we've been having to put a lot of technology introducing fuel burn, as I said, by about 1% each year. And those 1% are getting pretty hard now. You know, we're getting to physical limits in some areas. You know, we invest about £1 billion, $1.6 billion a year in R&D for these products. And I can tell you, wrestling the next 1% out is tough. So we've recently announced a whole new engine architecture change in order to realize the next few percent, which we call the advanced engine, and we've even announced the engine beyond that, which we call the ultrafan engine, to show that we can keep innovating and keep squeezing more and more efficiency out of these products. I mean, the net result of all that is, you know, the A350 with its Trent XWB engines is about 25% more fuel efficient per passenger kilometre than the models it replaces, and Boeing's 787 with its Trent 1000 engines is about 20% more efficient. So, you know, the industry is doing its bit. We must never be complacent. We've got to keep going. As Aysha said earlier on, aviation is 2% of global CO2. We must never sort of signal complacency. However, to contextualize, marine is 3% of global CO2, ground transportation is 30%, and the built environment is 50% of global CO2. So we always need to remind people that in the great sort of global sort of scheme of things, aviation is not a big player, but we have to do our part. Jonas mentioned biofuels, and he's right. There is a tension between what I'll call the political side, which is aviation being seen to do its bit, and the reality and the science. The reality and the science behind some biofuels is that you've really got to look into the detail to make sure they really are sustainable. We don't take a particular position as a company, but we certainly read reports from bodies that have analysed the whole cycle of biofuels, and basically taking plants that used to be eaten by humans and, you know, the waste passed into the ground, and instead burning that at 45,000 feet isn't necessarily the best way to produce sustainable future. Now, there's other types of biofuels that are not human crop replacement. But the point I'm trying to make is you've got to be really intelligent about it and look at the whole life cycle, and if it's sustainable and if it's available so we can get biofuels in the quantity we need, yes, we should support biofuels as an industry. And perhaps, to take Jonas's point, we ought to err on the side of supporting biofuels so as an industry we're seen to be doing something. So the answer is, you know, yes, we've got to keep innovating, we've got to keep going, we've got to look at the fuels, we've got to look at the airplanes, we've got to look at the engines, and we've got to look at the air traffic management side of things as well. I think you yourself, Peter, referred to an earlier speaker, I think surprised us all with his assertion that 11% of kilometres travelled in Europe are potentially unnecessary if Europe got its Air Traffic Management Act together. So that's another part of the equation we must attack. It should be an easy thing to fix compared with putting billions of pounds into airframe design and engines.
So if we look at what we're able to do engine technology, and we're looking at the regulators and what we're trying to do at ICAO on market-based measures, the one thing we're coming back to, as Paul just mentioned, is air traffic services, an ability to use satellite-based technology and maximize required nav performance, that virtually every aircraft coming off a production line has the capability to use that now. A deployment of ground infrastructure that allows us to get rid of radars, so we're moving more to the automated surveillance dependent broadcast, ADS-B. We're moving toward datacom platforms that are able to send messages between air traffic control nodes and also from the aircraft to the ground and vice versa. So all this technology is available and out there today. The military's been using this technology for years, but the big challenge is how do we keep the world in sync so that aircraft manufacturers and those that have to maintain them can build one one platform of equipage so that our operators only have to go, when they buy a new aircraft, it's going to have this capability for the future in it. One of the challenges we find is making sure standards are out there. So Aysha, can you touch on what ICAO is doing, looking at this global environment of air traffic services and what they're really looking toward as far as having people upgrade to a common standard?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, actually two main milestones that ICAO have been achieved recently is first have set one CO2 standard for engines. And I think this, Paul, probably you can elaborate more on that later. But this never happened in cars or other means of transportation to say, okay, this is the matrix, this is how much emissions the engines can emit. This is number one. Number two, and it is very, very important, and this is where it ties what you have mentioned, how can we bring everybody together, is the action plans. ICAO have just announced last year voluntary action plans, which means that each state now, for now, voluntarily can put an environmental action plan to say, okay, this is what we're doing to mitigate emissions. These are the challenges that we have, and this is what are we going to do to reduce our emissions. And this is, well, and we need an assistant in particular areas. And having this information shared with states, we will know the best practices on how we can bring all the industry together. And by the way, these action plans are not only for the government, they bring together basically the airlines, airports, and air traffic management together to see how each one and how they are doing their part in reducing emissions. And this will also help other countries to see the best practices and also help countries to exchange assistance. Like in case, some countries we know they're still developing and still need an assistance. And in aviation, this is a very, very crucial point because, we are an international industry. We travel between countries, and whatever we do, it affects not only the state itself, but it affects everybody.
Mohammed, when we do flight planning today in this modern world, we go and we have very sophisticated computer models that look at wind patterns, and you don't necessarily now fly a great circle route. You can actually fly a different route that allows you to maximize on the winds, the temperature, to get max efficiency out of your aircraft. But when we go back and we look at just the mix of military airspace with the civil airspace, and what seems like for years a conflict, and military airspace was based on a requirement of the way aircraft flew and the way people had to train back many years ago. Aircraft are maturing tremendously, and I know from my experience in the United States, airspace requirements for the military is changing radically. They'd much rather get rid of small airspace blocks and at a certain time of the day use a giant airspace block. But how do you tackle that challenge here in the region? How do you interface with your military counterparts to be able to work this equation of a balance between civil airspace and the military needs of their airspace?
As I said, the UAE is experience a massive growth in its aviation, and a big portion of its airspace is a military airspace, restricted airspace. And I think we were very fortunate with the coordination that we have so far with the military on certain aspects of using a restricted airspace. So we've been successful in this, coordinating with the military. I think the approach is not to say to the military, I want to take a portion of your airspace. Maybe you need to come up with a different, say, I need to use some of your airspace. Not to give it up, but to use it. So they're still the custodian of this airspace. They're free for you certain routes in certain time of the day, on heavy days, on heavy time of the day. So this is, I think, we've been successful in UAE here, negotiation coordinating with the military on this dual usage of the airspace.
Well, as we talk about airspace, we all know that there's a new challenge, a new tidal wave that's coming to us globally, and that's the unmanned aerial systems. And we look at this taking a perspective from different parts of the globe. In the Arctic, a lot of countries are using them for civil purposes, everything from fish patrol. We know in Japan they're using it for spectral analysis of crops and actually even doing some crop spraying with unmanned vehicles. And there's obviously one challenge down at low altitude for our rotorcraft community, but as you get to larger UAVs that will be up there competing with the airspace, and also the reliability to make sure that they don't stray into airspace that become a conflict, especially in the terminal area for Jonas's airport and others out there, that we see a proliferation of unmanned vehicles that'll happen quickly there, but how do we restrict them? How, Jonas, do you guys look at the problem there, and how much is the airport being able to interact with the authorities in Europe to be able to look at the oncoming UAS problem?
Yeah, I must say we're not very involved in that subject. I can tell you a story about how we tend to react to things and how things change. So a couple of years ago, we invested in a flight tracking company, and with our seed capital fund together with Air France and KLM. And so we invested in this flight tracking company, and they were giving information about where the planes would go around Schiphol. And so then we went to our press office and we said, we have this investment, €500,000 or so. And we said, we want to have a public announcement. And then our press office said, we don't communicate about noise. This is our policy. And then we went to KLM's press office and they said the same thing. We don't communicate about noise. And now, a couple of years later, this is one of the big things in the community because everybody sees what happens, etc. So the story is, and also to your point earlier on, that we are a very good industry and that we can innovate. People have to see benefits, have to see things, so you have to dare. So also on this question that you have, I think on this unmanned airplanes, everybody sees only the downside in a perception. I'm talking about perception, not on how it is. So try to think of ways in which we can make it feasible and beneficiary to everybody. And then it will work, because all these things go either by disaster or by people wanting to pay something for it or being attracted to it.
One thing that I think we all can be very proud of in this industry is how safe we are. I mean, few modes of travel that you can possibly think of that can be as safe as aviation. And so when we have something that has happened recently with the Malaysian flight, and that we look at it and say, in this world that we all think is very small, there's big oceans out there. But Hussein, when you look at it from an airline's perspective, and we know that there is a equipage cost to the operators to be able to go and put in, let's say, a satellite tracking system, whether we use space-based ADS-B or have different types of emergency locator, the ELTs that we have out there today that have a capability to go and be jettisoned if something extreme happened. These all come with a cost. And how do we balance those, and how is IATA looking at this challenge?
You know, safety in the airline business is first and foremost. And in IATA, we have the IOSA system that certifies the airlines to make sure that they are operating according to international standards and operate safely around the world. Sometimes airlines tell us this is going to be very costly for us to do such and such. We say, well, try an accident and see how that expensive that is. So it's you know, there is no price for safety, and no airline should really consider the price as a hindrance for ensuring their full safety of the operations. We in IATA encourage all airlines to go through the IOSA system, and we even convince the African countries through the Abuja Declaration, where the governments in Africa gave instructions to all airlines that by September 2015, no airline will have an AOC, an operating license, without having passed the IOSA audit, which really we believe will raise the standard of safety, at least in a part of the world that has always been lagging behind international standards, and that is in Africa.
Paul, I think as time expires here, I want to give you the last word and just kind of give us a snapshot. You know, again, during this search for the missing airliner, we heard about the burst transmissions that we get out of the engine just for overall engine maintenance capability and our ability to offboard that. But where is the industry going, whether it's Rolls, whether it's GE, Pratt, Safran, any of the big companies that are out there producing engines, where are we going in the future of using technology and health monitoring systems to be able to tell us how to fly these machines better, to do preventative maintenance, to make them more efficient and reduce emissions?
Well, Peter, there's a common thread that comes out from many of these discussions, and that's the fact that we'd really like more bandwidth to keep us constantly connected to the aircraft. For safety reasons, in-flight entertainment systems would quite like a real-time link to enable to give passengers a sort of video-on-demand service. But as engine manufacturers and representing the airframers here, we'd also like a real-time service, please, so we can keep absolute constant tabs on the engine and airframe system, so we can yet further improve reliability and performance. We're working towards prognostics now that mean when the aircraft lands, it's not just the engine parts are ready to swap out when they're needed, but also the servicing of the aircraft and the engine is now starting to align so that the aircraft is only pulled off the line for one service shop visit for both engine and aircraft. So that's the place we're trying to get to give our customers, the airlines, a better service. So data, the use of big data, better data analytics, and more real-time bandwidth to the aircraft for all of the reasons that we've spoken of before. Can I make one further comment, Peter, if you don't mind, about how innovative you can get if you have a real-time link to aircraft? And it comes back to a comment that you made earlier on. EasyJet, which is Europe's largest carrier, came up with some innovation that used a real-time link to the aircraft to be able to relay weather data from a satellite in real time into the cockpit so the pilot can see weather beyond the range of the weather radar on the aircraft. Now that's great innovation because then the pilot can steer a course around the weather incident well before he or she has reached that point. So that just shows you how unlocking bandwidth just is an enabler for innovation. And I think it'll be an enabler for reducing fuel burn, for safety, for servicing, for reliability. So our plea to the industry is take bandwidth more seriously.
Well, these are fascinating topics, and I wish that we had the time to go on, but I would ask all of you to join me in thanking our expert panel today. Thank you.